of place. It's organized around maritime trade and the control of trade routes and shipping routes. If one were looking at Portuguese activity in the 16th century through blinders that were placed there by the Spanish experience, one might say, well, that really doesn't look like an empire at all, when in fact it was a strong, durable entity that lasted for a very long time, derived wealth for a monarchy and for merchants for a very long time, but was just organized in a different way. It wasn't predicated or based upon the amassing of territory. The final one, I hope I'm not ruining the story or ruining my lecture for anyone, but right, I listed under contradictions. I guess it's an irony is one way to think it. It might be a poignant fact is that Magellan doesn't survive the expedition. The expedition is completed by members of his crew. I don't know that that means we have to place Magellan's name in the lineage of great voyagers with an asterisk, but it definitely is something for us to recognize and to keep in mind, in that the expedition is completed posthumously for Magellan. All right, so this is what I'm calling the bundle of contradictions that adds additional intellectual heft to the story for me. All right, I'll talk through some what I'm calling structural realities for us to understand European expansion. Again, that 1492/1494 description of European activity. There is a world of trade, interaction, luxury goods, and the movement of mercantile items that is organized around the Mediterranean, with Constantinople as a crucial place, as well as Venice and other port city-states. That world is, it's not shattered, but it's definitely impacted very strongly in 1453 when Constantinople is incorporated into, let's call it the Turkish Empire now. There are luxury items that were central, crucial components of international trade, oceanic trade at the time, that are no longer accessible to Europeans. It's kind of, again, there are really complex reasons why Iberians are expanding out of Europe in that 1492, 1494 moment. This is one of them. It is looking for new markets and looking for replacement goods for items that had been structurally present elements of international trade. So Iberians are seeking analogs. They're really quite instrumental and clear about this. Their records show, and there are instructions given to merchants and settlers to look for items in the Americas or items elsewhere in the world that can replace absent items. The fourth point that is a structural reality, again, this gets me back to my ethno-historicism, is that Europeans are entering well-established systems of local and regional trade. The Bay of Bengal and the Red Sea are just two examples that I list there. But in a lot of ways, Europeans are expanding into worlds that have developed ongoing systems within them. And you can see, again, a point of comparison between the Americas and Asia, right, is that what the Spanish do in the Americas is a process of territorial conquest and the replacement of indigenous state systems. The Portuguese are not able to do that. They're not equipped to do that. And it might not be the strategy that makes sense for them to prosper in these regions. It's a different form of expansion, but it does bring them into contact with, and in some ways competition with, existing systems of trade that are present. The last one is that there's polities, right? There are rulers, there are merchants, there are classes of people who either control or are trying to control these regional trade systems, city-states, ports, harbors that are oriented around them, and that again, a point of comparison or distinction is that what the Spanish are able to do in the 1520s in Mexico, if you know the story of the fall of Tenochtitlan, right, they're able to replace that polity and state system and put in place something else, something that's managed by them. As we'll see, the Portuguese in Asia don't really have the capability to do that. They don't really have the capability to do that in Africa either. It's a structural reality that plays a part in Magellan's circumnavigation, so I think it's important to bring it to our attention now. Just very quickly, I've been framing this 1494 moment. This is just a slide to show you the world in the way that a treaty in 1494 that was mediated by the Pope between Spain and Portugal kind of carved the globe into neat and wonderful parts, right? So you can see that the Americas are on this side. This is what, let's call this the Spanish side. You can see that Brazil is the bulge that falls into the Portuguese side. Africa and Asia are within, let's call it the Portuguese sphere of influence. What I can talk about, and again, if I'm going to draw out this comparison, it's a little quick and dirty, but right, this empire is organized around the conquest and the conquest of space and the replacement of polities. The Portuguese activity, the Portuguese empire in these zones, different, not so much. The easy answer that I can give you, again, is the one that I mentioned earlier, is that the polities, right, the nations, the city-states, the empires that the Portuguese meet and interact with in Africa and in Asia are of a different sort, and Portuguese capabilities to conquer are of a different sort. So the framework of expansion in the world is distinct and different. The Portuguese actually begin a process of exploration and rounding Africa, and they begin that process actually in the 15th century. The way that they do it is kind of by steps, right? That they are making their way around Africa. They ultimately do make their way to Asia. Those steps involve maritime exploration, if we can call it that. They involve engagement with local rulers and local peoples. It involves an embeddedness in a slave trade and the creation of staple goods. But it's a mediated process that in some cases involves warfare and conquest, but is distinct and different. And it's useful to compare it to what the Spanish are doing in the Americas. It's a different framework, it's a different way of expanding across the globe. And in the same way that the Portuguese are making hops around Africa and the coast and establishing forts or city-states or factories at strategic points in the globe, they are also envisioning an imperial system that is knit together around port cities and strategic port cities, right? So that one way to draw the comparison is that the Spanish conquest is about drawing together contiguous zones of conquest of space, right? That there's an attempt by the Spanish to kind of settle or at least establish a presence across the Americas. The Portuguese are thinking in a different way. They're planning and they're acting to establish strategic maritime points across the globe, which will allow them to have a networked maritime empire. I'm going to, I think I'll just stop there and turn to Magellan's expedition that gets going in 1519. So he leaves Europe with 5 ships. in the summer of 1519. They arrive in the Canaries on the 21st of September, and they make the crossing and arrive in the Americas in the winter, so 13th December. They leave Rio de Janeiro, right? They spend Christmas there and leave on the 26th. They arrive deep in southern South America, I'll call it that, in early February, and they arrive at Port St. Julian. It's a name that Magellan gives for that port on the 31st of March, 1520. At this point, and it's worth stopping at this point, 3 of Magellan's ships mutiny. The sailors on these ships mutiny, and there are leaders of this mutiny. The descriptions of the circumnavigation describe Magellan as being, he's very angry. He acts really quickly. He acts really decisively. He puts down the mutinies. One mutineer is killed in media res, right, in the midst of the mutiny. Another leader of the mutiny is beheaded after a modified judicial process, right? As the commander of the expedition, Magellan tries that figure and beheads him. So after that is all put to rights, if you want to think in those terms, the expedition actually enters the strait that bears Magellan's name now. Magellan orders guns fired, as I say there, when they actually see the other side, right, when they go from the Atlantic to the Pacific side. But the important fact really to keep in mind is that it really takes 36 days for Magellan to navigate the strait that bears his name. As I'll show you some images and some slides, it's not like a straight shot through the Strait of Magellan. You might get that impression from its name, but it really is, I won't say time-consuming. Magellan took his time in order to find his path through there. Right, in some way, I've been asking you to think of the Iberian activity as having a Spanish wing and a Portuguese wing. Magellan's circumnavigation can similarly be framed in that way. So the arrival to the strait is, let's call it the American part, and then the expedition definitely has a, let's call it an Asian component. They arrive at Guam on the 6th of March, 1521. Magellan called the place the Isle of Thieves because a group of natives came and stole a skiff. Magellan's response was to head into the mainland and burn the village. It's unclear, as I read these accounts, whether he burned the right village. It's unclear whether he exacted his revenge on the people who actually stole the skiff, but we'll leave that to one side. They reached the Philippines, and what I have here is that Magellan is conducted to Cebu. That's a complex story. He arrives at Cebu on the 2nd of April. It's a major city. It's a major polity. It has a major ruler who's recognized. But prior to that, Magellan is described as having some pretty complex interactions with a local monarch who recognizes his importance, welcomes him as an outsider doing interesting things, and that figure is the man who conducts Magellan to Cebu, this major city, introduces him to the king and the royal family of Cebu. As you can see right at the next bulleted point, things are going fabulously well. The royal family, the king decides that he wants to be baptized, that he wants to convert. Again, it underscores this element of there have been scholars for a long time who have stressed the maritime elements of Magellan's experience, right? Again, those narratives in history. Again, it might be difficult to place Magellan in that framework of the onward march of science and, you know, moving from the Dark Ages, which includes the Inquisition, to something else, when we realize that Christianity conversion was a major, it was really important to Magellan.